Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenour, and it's going to be a phenomenal episode today. Hope everyone has been doing well and enjoyed this past week. I'm sure you have all been anxiously awaiting the election results and, have been paying close attention to that, but I appreciate everyone lending me their ears for a little bit today, take a little break from all the presidential stuff, and just listen to some good old-fashioned baseball talk. We have a lot to cover today, a lot of news going around the league in regards to, some new managerial hires, some teams letting go of their front office staff, and a ton more. I'll get right into it, and I'll first get right into the recent rehiring of Alex Cora to the Red Sox, and I'll grade the three latest managerial hires and discuss which ones I like the most and least, and I'll also mention any other relevant news in the baseball world. I'll then get into the Gold Glove and Silver Slugger award winners and pick out which winners stuck out to me from both awards and which I felt were very fitting for the award. Later on, I'll give my year-in-review wrap-up, share some of my favorite moments of the season, some player performances that stuck out to me, and really anything in between, just kind of give my overall analysis and kind of recap of the entire season, if you will. And be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I'll mention some more news, the recent charges being brought to a former Tampa Bay Rays first-rounder of murder, and mention some other huge scandals and legal issues players have had to face over the years. So some really good stuff ahead of us today. I'm going to dive right into it, and like I mentioned, the Red Sox have officially rehired Alex Cora as their manager, and let me tell you what, that is no shock to me. I think there are a lot of reasons why this move was made, and I think it's not a terrible move. Honestly, out of all the different managerial moves that were made, this one, probably made the most sense, I would think. But again, I'm going to unpack this a little bit. And like we all know, Cora, like Hinch, was a part of the Astros team that cheated their way to the World Series in 2017. But Alex Cora has a deep history to the city of Boston, as he was a player for the Red Sox for 3 seasons during his playing career. And one of those seasons, he helped them win the World Series in 2007. So he has a strong relationship with the people of Boston, the organization, the team, and as a result, it really makes this hire make probably some of the most sense out of all the 3 hires that we've seen so far in the last, 2 weeks or so. Now, Cora's playing career took many turns, as he also spent time with the Dodgers, the Indians, the Mets, Rangers, and Nationals before he was involved in the coaching side of baseball and he retired from his playing career. He first started out as a coach for the Astros, which again is where this whole story really begins with the cheating scandal, and it was actually his only year there. He went on to be the manager of the Red Sox for 2018 and 2019, but then after that 2019 season, he was suspended for a year. He won a World Series with the Red Sox in 2018, so he really does well with the fan base there. I mean, he clearly resembles 2 very important years in Red Sox history. He actually, fun fact, just a little side note, he's been a part of 2 of the longest games recorded in MLB history. So he is part of some big historical moments in baseball and in Red Sox history. But what I'm curious about is how will this move work out in the long run? How will he be, how long will he be around, and could there be anything that further surfaces that implicates him at all? And I know that he's already been offered, I believe it was a 2-year contract with the option to extend it another 2 years after those initial first 2 years are up. So we'll see how things go after the first 2 years in Boston again. I really, honestly, I don't hate the hire, but I think the one thing that I don't like about it is that it kind of allows people in baseball, and I think just, whether it's players or managers, coaches, whatever, it's kind of giving this feeling that, okay, we understand that what we did was wrong, but we're still going to come out of it, and we're going to get a second chance no matter what. And again, it kind of rubs me the wrong way a little bit when everybody hypes the scandal up as something that was even bigger than what steroids was back in, the mid to late 2000s. And now, all of a sudden, everybody is like, well, it's okay, we'll allow them back into baseball, and I was actually talking to a friend of mine about this. Their hires, A.J. Hinch and Alex Cora, they're not too far in regards to, time in which that they were rehired or hired back into managerial positions. I mean, A.J. Hinch was hired about 2 weeks ago, and then this past week, we see Alex Cora getting rehired. So it's a very quick turnaround that they were able to, again, they were suspended for a whole year from baseball, and I would love to know, when their suspension was fully eradicated, when it was over and when it went into full effect, and then when it was going to end. Because it seems like whenever it was, it must have just, very not too soon after, the World Series, it must have ended very quickly, because both managers have been rehired within a week from each other just about. So I think that's also kind of interesting. But I think for the most part, it just gives the wrong message that if you do something like this, cheating in that regard to that extent, you're going to be able to eventually make your way back into baseball. And again, I hate to continue to use him as an example, but somebody like Pete Rose, who continues to be cheated out of the Hall of Fame, he's continuing to get the raw end of the deal, whereas Alex Cora and A.J. Hinch, who have been a part of, and again, who knows how directly related they were to the entire situation, who knows how much A.J. Hinch knew, but if you're the manager of the team, you've got to know something, right? Same thing with Alex Cora. I mean, if he's on the bench, with the players as a coach, you've got to know something's up. And it's just showing that even though that you do something that wrong and that just not okay, break those kind of rules, you're going to still be allowed back into baseball. And I think that just kind of sends the wrong message to people in baseball and just really just fans in general, because now you're allowing people to say, hey, I'm going to be able to do that, and if I get in trouble, I might get hit with a year-long suspension, but then I'll be back in baseball. I'm going to get rehired. And especially with the Red Sox, I mean, I don't know if I just felt like it was very, I don't want to say ironic, but it was kind of interesting that they went ahead and just rehired him. It was almost like they were just waiting for, this suspension to be over, and then they were just they had all the intentions in the world of allowing him back to being a manager. Now, the other thing about this is that Cora is very well liked by the players. So that's another reason why I feel this hire makes somewhat some sense, in some regards. Because Xander Bogaerts was very outspoken on social media when Alex Cora initially got this suspension. Also, Eduardo Rodriguez, another guy that was very outspoken. I believe one of the two, I can't remember who it was, but they referred to Alex Cora as more of a friend than a manager. So he clearly has a great, player-manager relationship with the team, and I think that really does well for him. And not to mention, I mean, he does great with the fan base. The fans clearly like him. I mean, he's obviously been part of 2 very important years in Red Sox history, winning 2 World Series with the team, one as a manager, one as a player. So somebody that is a well-liked, fan favorite that is going to be, again, probably received back with welcoming, open arms. And there's going to be, hey, you know what, whatever's in the past is in the past. We're going to just move on from that. But on the other end of it, there has been some disgruntlement within, internally the Red Sox, because I guess the front office is not a huge fan of Alex Cora, and people aren't sure if it was, the old front office staff that decided to, rehire him, or, if it was the new, whoever it was, whomever made this final decision. I think that there's a lot of kind of murmurs going around internally about the Red Sox not being, at least the front office not being too keen on the rehiring of Alex Cora. And again, and I wouldn't be shocked if some people, I can see both sides. I can see why people are happy about it, and I can see why people are not happy about it. And again, it's kind of one of those, you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, if you will, if you're somebody within the organization of the Red Sox or what have you, because now you have to say, okay, how is this going to kind of affect me and my image and the team's image publicly in the eyes of everybody else by allowing somebody like Alex Cora back onto the bench and back on to the team after we all know what he was a part of and what he did? But then the other caveat of it is, okay, do I just let him go and have to go and completely find a new manager? And who knows if it's going to be a manager that's going to fit. At least they know with this, it's going to work, and the chemistry is there. And clearly, this past year, the Red Sox were really out of whack. And I think that Cora is going to reel them back in. I think that he's going to be able to really get them all to buckle down and have a really good year next year. I know that they're, trying to go after some new free agents. I think Trevor Bauer would be interesting. I think George Springer would be interesting if they don't re-sign JBJ. And if that's the case, Alex Cora is going to have pretty much a very similar, I mean, not very similar, but kind of the same idea of a team that he had in 2018. Great outfielders, really good pitching, good hitting across the board, something he's very familiar with and something that he can work with. So I think that will be very interesting to see how he's able to come back and really regain the reins of this Red Sox team after being away for a year. But again, I think he's going to be welcomed back with open arms inside of that locker room, inside of that clubhouse. But this is all in all, I think it will be a good year, I think, for the Red Sox with this hire. They've got their sights set on some big-time free agents, like I mentioned. But I think that I'm really curious about how these managerial hires are going to really work out in the long run and which ones are going to be the best. Personally, I think that Alex Cora will probably be the best hire out of the three recent ones we've seen between Cora, Hinch, and La Russa. I think just because, again, of the familiarity of the relationships that he has with the players and the fan base in Boston, and just being able to, he's not far removed from the world of baseball. He's understanding of what baseball is like today. It's a very different game than it was 25 years ago. So he's aware of the changes, and he's up to date on those changes. So I think that Cora in Boston makes the most sense. I think that's going to probably be the best hire in the long run. Now, I think it could be a toss-up between Hinch and La Russa. Again, it's going to be very interesting seeing those two go at it since they're going to be in the same division now with each other. But I think that having A.J. Hinch as the Tigers manager makes a little bit more sense than La Russa with the White Sox. And here's why. Again, it goes back to A.J. Hinch is much more up-to-date and much more up to speed on the world of baseball now. And he's not, he hasn't been removed from baseball for, at least being removed from a managerial position for at least 10 years. Unlike La Russa, well, I guess 9 technically, but once he goes back into full effect, it would be, his 10th anniversary of, not being a manager to becoming a manager. He stopped in 2011, and then 2021, he'll go back to being a manager again. So I think that A.J. Hinch would probably be a good fit because, again, this team has got a lot of pieces that it can work with. And similar to Alex Cora, he's been familiar with working with a team that's got some pieces to work with. And like I mentioned in my last episode, he's also been able to turn teams around. A.J. Hinch came from, the Astros after having a stint with the Diamondbacks and completely turned them around. So he's able to do that. He kind of has that effect of, hey, I can come in, I can change an entire, franchise's trajectory. I can change the entire everything, kind of the image that the team has in the MLB, and I can turn them from a losing ball club to a winning ball club. And then obviously I think the last one that really makes probably, again, it makes some sense, but not as much sense as the Hinch and Cora hires. La Russa, in Chicago. I think that although, he's a great baseball mind and he's a managerial legend, and he's one of the greatest managers ever, hands down. I just think that he's, again, been a little bit removed from baseball for a little while in terms of being in the clubhouse, being in the dugout, being aware of how that kind of works, and especially since baseball has changed so much since he's left. And on top of it, yes, he's been in executive positions and he's been in front office positions, but that's totally different than being in the middle of the season with the guys every single day, kind of that grind. I think that it'll work out in the end because out of the three teams, the White Sox, as of right now, have the best, I think, talent across the board. I think that, player for player, they have clearly better talent than the Tigers do. And as of right now, unless, the Red Sox go out and add a bunch of pieces, they've got more talent, in my opinion, than the Red Sox do. You've got Nick Madrigal, you've got Tim Anderson, who's a Silver Slugger, Jose Abreu, who's an MVP candidate, you've got Eloy Jimenez. The list goes on and on and on. You've got Dallas Keuchel on the mound. You've got Lucas Giolito on the mound. You've got Alex Colon coming out of the bullpen if he stays around with the team. So La Russa definitely has much more to play around with and has many more pieces. So it's going to be interesting. Can Hinch and Cora kind of make do with what they have and be successful, or will La Russa almost, I don't want to say, kind of ride the coattails of the talent that he has, but in a sense, kind of do that and really benefit from being on a team that's got a lot of ability and has a lot of potential, and as a result, you've got a lot of star power, kind of makes it easy on you as a manager. So that'll be very interesting to see how that works in the long run. But again, at the end of the day, I think that they were all three solid hires. I think they're all three solid baseball minds, and I think that they'll work out in the long run. And I think it will just depend on which teams out of those three are going to have the quickest and probably, the most obvious turnaround and the most glaringly obvious kind of, change in development and just performance overall in the next year or two. So that's just some manager news, just throwing that out there. But now I want to get into the recent firing of the Mets GM and his entire front staff, what that could mean. I mean, that was very interesting. I know that the Mets were just recently bought by someone else. I can't remember his name, but I know that they're pretty much cleaning house. I mean, the GM of the Mets from last year was fired. Majority of his staff, if not all of his staff, was fired. And it makes me wonder what's going on in New York. What's going on with the Mets? I know, at least I think I know, that they re-signed Michael Wacha and they re-signed Ricky Porcello. I don't know what is happening with Marcus Stroman. That's going to be something interesting to watch because I've seen things from he might go back to Toronto, he might stay in New York, maybe he'll go to Boston, lots of different places that Stroman could wind up. And if that's the case, what are they going to do in free agency? It kind of makes me wonder, who are they going to go after? I feel like the old GM was going in one direction, and the new owners were not a fan of that. And whatever direction they want to go in, could we see them go after big-time names like Trevor Bauer? Or are we going to see them go after big-time names like JT Realmuto? I mean, Realmuto has actually been thrown out around their name a whole lot this offseason so far. And again, we're only about a couple weeks, maybe a month removed from baseball, and we're already hearing things like, Realmuto is a most likely target for the Mets, and we could potentially see him land there. And I think that would work out really well. Not to mention, it would make even more sense for them to go after more pitching because Syndergaard's going to be out all of 2021. You can't rely completely on Jacob deGrom because it's only one person, even though he's incredible. Again, you can only do so much as one pitcher out of a 5 starting man rotation. If they did actually, and I have to probably double-check this, if they did actually re-sign Wacha and Porcello, that definitely helps them out a little bit. Now they have to figure out what do they want to do with Stroman, and then do they want to go after another pitcher potentially? And if that's the case, I mean, again, Trevor Bauer is going to be the hottest name on any free agent market just because of his willingness. And I was actually mentioning this to a friend the other day. He's pretty much revolutionized the idea of being a free agent in baseball, allowing for anybody and anyone who wants to pay him either a year-long contract or a lengthier contract. He's willing to pay for, to play for anybody, and that's very unique. That's something you don't see out of a lot of different players, especially when they know their worth and they know that they're very talented. You're usually seeing them go after the big markets, but Trevor Bauer, very talented. He's aware of that, and he's, I think, very curious about where could I wind up, where are the best places for me to go. But I think all in all, it's going to be an interesting offseason for the Mets. I think it's already started to get very interesting, and especially with the firing of their GM. I'm also very curious to see who their new GM will be. So a lot of different things going around, lots of new moving pieces that, have been really going on recently in the baseball world. I am definitely excited to see how many more moves are going to happen throughout this offseason, what free agents we start hearing about, what hirings we start hearing about, this, that, and the other. Baseball offseason is super exciting. I know it's not as exciting as the regular season, but the offseason, it feels like every day you never know. Something might change. Somebody might get hired, and somebody might get released. You never know. So that's what's exciting about it. But again, I'll continue to share all the latest and greatest news on this offseason. But that'll do it for us in this first segment. Stay right there, folks, because after the commercial, I'll mention some of the Silver Slugger and Gold Glove Award winners that stuck out to me the most from the awards that were given out this past week or two. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer with you all, and in our first segment, I got into the recent news going around the league, specifically the recent rehiring of Alex Cora by the Red Sox, and also mentioning which recent hires I think were the most beneficial so far. Stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I will get into the recent story about a former first-round draft pick by the Tampa Bay Rays being charged with murder, and what some other big-time baseball scandals have been over the past few years. I want to now jump into some of the Silver Slugger and Gold Glove Award winners that stood out to me the most and who I think were most deserving of the awards. So the Gold Glovers, I want to start with them, and I'm going to mention some of the names that really stuck out to me. And the first one that I have to say just jumped out immediately was Evan White from the Seattle Mariners over at first base position. Now, White for most of the year really struggled from the plate. I mean, he was at one point someone I painted as being a potentially, or at least a potential bench player as the season went on if he had continued to hit the way that he did. I mean, he was hitting below 200 for most of the season. But as a 17th overall pick by the Mariners, I think there was no question he would be in the lineup regardless. I mean, you can't just waste a pick that high and not see what kind of happens and try to develop him. But his fielding definitely stepped up for him in big ways because his batting numbers were not good. He only hit 176 this year. He had 8 homers and 26 RBI, so he did have some pop in his bat, but not much. I mean, he had a 67 OPS plus and a 252 on-base percentage. So he didn't fare well from the plate at all. Not somebody that was getting on base much. Sure, he drove in some runs for them, but it wasn't anything special. But his defensive ability couldn't be ignored. I mean, he had 7 total defensive runs saved this year, which was first among AL players at his position. So White definitely made up for his lack of performance at the plate with how well he played in the field. I think if White figures out the hitting, he clearly can have a really, really big career. I mean, he's got the ability fielding-wise and defensively. I think he just needs to adjust to the speed offensively of the Major League game. I mean, the defense, again, it speaks for itself. He only had 1 error out of 403 total chances in the field. That sounds like pretty impressive numbers, to say the least. I think White can have a good career. He's just going to have to be able to figure out the hitting. And, again, I think that if he's going to want to last long in this league and he wants to be a long-tenured player, he's definitely going to have to become a little bit more comfortable from the plate. So the next guy that really stuck out to me, Alex Cora, winning another Gold Glove. I mean, what a way to go out. The 36-year-old outfielder decides to walk away from the game after 13 years. He's retired right now, again, after this season. I think it's fair to say Gordon has seen baseball at some of its best as he has been around for many years, but more importantly, he has been a big part of this Royals team for many years, spending his entire career there. He had 3 straight All-Star selections, and he compiled 8 Gold Gloves. He just amassed his 4th straight Gold Glove award, and he's actually done that another time. He won 4 straight earlier in the 2010s, and then he won 4 straight in the latter part of the 2010s. Not to mention, he didn't allow 1 error all year long. I mean, he was incredible in the field. I think that Gordon was a very good player for the Royals, and a player that spent his entire career with them as well. He won a World Series with them, and he experienced some very good years in Kansas City, like in 2011, where he batted .303, had 23 homers and 87 RBIs. So not only did he have a lot of team success, but he had a lot of personal player success, and this was a much-deserving retirement present for Gordon, as he clearly did a lot for the baseball world. But he was a huge importance and a massive impact on the Royals. I actually remember when they had the Home Run Derby in Kansas City. They had the All-Star game there a couple years ago. A lot of people in Kansas City were very, very upset that I believe Alex Cora either didn't get elected to the All-Star team or he wasn't in the Home Run Derby. One of the two. But people were very, very, very angry about that. I mean, people in Kansas City adored Alex Cora, and I think he was kind of one of those players. You know, I don't want to say that they are a once-in-a-lifetime player because, I mean, he was very good, but he wasn't somebody that is going to probably make the Hall of Fame most likely. He's definitely someone that you associate the team with, though. He's definitely kind of that cornerstone player, somebody that's been around forever. He's had a lot of success, and the fans love him. The organization loves him, and he kind of is the identifier of that team. I mean, when you think of Kansas City Royals, Alex Cora is definitely one of the first players that pop into my head in recent memories. It's kind of like Miguel Cabrera and the Detroit Tigers, or somebody like, Albert Pujols. Growing up, I always associated, the Cardinals with Albert Pujols or vice versa. So he kind of has that association factor, if you will, where if you think of the Royals, you're most likely thinking about Alex Cora, or at least he's a player that jumps to mind. Now, the next guy that I want to talk about that also won a Gold Glove, Trent Grisham. It was awesome to see someone bounce back from really a horrible way to end the year last year, as he would and he was the one that boot the ball for the Milwaukee Brewers and caused the Nationals to come back and win in the NL wildcard last year. And now this year, he was one of the best outfielders in the MLB, and in the NL specifically this past season. He was the league leader in outs above average with 6, and he led all NL center fielders with 7 defensive runs scored. 7 defensive runs saved. I think that Grisham really redeemed himself from last year. He also batted much better this year. I mean, jumped up 20 points in his batting average from last year to this year, and he increased his OPS plus numbers from 90 last year to 122 this year. So a ginormous jump in that regard also. ago, and he's really improved drastically in a year, which I have to say is a big turnaround from the way his 2019 season ended, which I think many Brewer fans, including myself, can agree did not sit well with them at all. I mean, that was I was actually at the game, and it was a brutal thing to watch, just seeing him kick the ball and it just goes, or actually he just let it go right underneath his glove. That was painful to watch, to say the least. So the final Gold Glover that really stuck out to me that won their award, Mookie Betts. I mean, how could I not mention him on this list? What a year. This doesn't end Mookie, this year didn't end with just Mookie winning a World Series title. Continues on with an incredible honor with the Gold Glove. Betts batted .292 this year, so definitely did it from the plate as well as in the field. He won his first Gold Glove in the NL, in part due to an incredible defensive showing with 11 defensive runs saved, and he won his first World Series in the NL. I mean, what couldn't he do this year, right? I mean, he was pretty phenomenal all around. I mean, he was arguably, in my opinion, one of the top three just all-around baseball players in baseball in terms of fielding, hitting, throwing, batting, everything. He was top-notch. And he was a huge part of the Dodgers' success this year. And I'm sure the fans in Boston missed him greatly because their year was drastically different from a year ago. So you can see just the impact he had on that team. And obviously they lost other pieces as well. But I think the most important was Betts without question. And then we also see how important he was to his new team now. Huge part, huge factor in their success this season. Was a really just a fun season to watch Mookie Betts play in the Dodgers uniform. Now I want to get into my Silver Slugger award winners that stood out to me, because there was a lot of other guys who won these awards that, again, really kind of jumped out to me and I was very impressed with. Donovan Solano was the first guy. I mean, he only played half the year last year, but wherever he left off from last year, he picked back up with this year. And he really played great all the way through. I mean, last year he batted .330 with a .456 slugging percentage over 81 games he played a season ago. Now, this year, in 54 games, he put up a .326 batting average, but his OBP and his slugging all went up from .360 and .456 respectively to this year batting .365 and .463 respectively in OBP and slugging. I mean, he was a huge part of the Giants this year, who they didn't have a lot of really great bats in the lineup. They had him, Yastrzemski, so on, and a couple other guys, but it wasn't a lot of people. It wasn't a very deep team. So it was great to see that Solano could step up and really carry the team, hitting-wise. And he wasn't the greatest fielder either. I mean, he led the NL in errors committed with 11, so not great with the glove, but nonetheless, he had a really awesome season from the plate. And I think that, who knows, if we start seeing these guys, and if the DH slowly comes into the NL, we could potentially start seeing these guys that are usually in the field just get converted over to DHs, and we might start seeing some players have some, stratospheric or kind of just out of control great years and great seasons. I mean, again, another person, Marcell Ozuna, is a perfect example. He was able to switch over from just a fielder and a hitter to just strictly a hitter this past season. And, I mean, his abilities, I feel, skyrocketed. I mean, they shot through the roof. I mean, he had a really, really good year. So the next Silver Slugger that I want to discuss, Tim Anderson. The 2019 batting champion, again, was honored properly this year, getting the Silver Slugger award that he deserved. And I just felt like last year, he led the league in batting average at .335, and this year he batted .322. But his OPS went up from .865 last year to .886 this year. I just feel like he was kind of robbed last year. I mean, he had a great season all year long, did not make an all-star team, didn't win a Silver Slugger, didn't win a Gold Glove, didn't win anything. But he was the batting champion in the AL. So I just didn't understand why he was not giving the fair credit that he deserved. Not to mention, his OPS plus has really jumped up from last year. I mean, it was 128 last year to 141 this year. So a lot of improvements in those hitting categories for Anderson. And again, I mean, a 128 OPS plus is great, but if you're jumping it up another almost 20 points or so to 141, that's even better. And I still just don't get how he wasn't anything last year, an all-star or a Silver Slugger. I mean, the guy has been incredible since last year, and I just don't quite get why he was not recognized for anything. But regardless, he was noticed this year, and for good reason. I mean, he had a phenomenal season, and I'm just really excited to see him kind of continue to develop as a player and really start to, I think become a household name in not only the NL but the MLB. I think he has the ability to be a top-notch second baseman, shortstop, kind of middle infielder, and I think that he's on a great team. Again, I'm very high up on the White Sox because I see the potential they have, I see the abilities that they have, and I see the personnel that they have. And Tim Anderson being one of them, it's clear that he does a lot for this team. I mean, he is a huge part of it. So, again, I'm excited to see how he kind of develops and continues to improve and get better, because I think that the sky's the limit, really, for Tim Anderson. So getting down to the final two Silver Sluggers that really stuck out to me at the catcher position, Travis d'Arnaud. Now, this was a career year for d'Arnaud, at least hitting-wise, as he batted with a .919 OPS this year, which was actually 200 points higher than his career OPS at .719. And he had 39 RBIs and 9 homers this year. So the Braves catcher, I think, has set himself up nicely for free agency this year. I think he will be a very sought-after player, especially with the numbers he put up at the catcher position. I mean, that's even better. I mean, you don't really have many catchers. Him, again, Real Muto, not many guys that are able to hit that well as a catcher. And it kind of shows that if you're a catcher and you're able to hit above 300 for an entire year, you're going to be the talk of the town, especially on the free agent market. And like I mentioned, Real Muto being on the market, I think he will definitely be very sought after and probably one of the most sought after free agents this offseason, definitely the most sought after catcher. But I think d'Arnaud will land on a good contending team because he is a solid bat in the lineup. He's not a great fielding catcher, so that does hurt him a little bit. He was moved over to the DH position for a few games, so he could be someone that benefits from the DH and it could convert over into a hitting-oriented role only. So if that happens, we might see d'Arnaud go back to the AL. Again, he used to play for the Tampa Bay Rays before coming to Atlanta. We could see him going back to the AL if the DH doesn't stick around in the NL, because I feel like he could be, again, another case like Marcell Ozuna, maybe somebody like Donovan Solano, who, if they were just converted strictly to a designated hitter, they would have a phenomenal career. Their careers would probably, again, jump up about 10 notches than what they are right now. And I think d'Arnaud is going to be somebody that is going to be, again, sought after very heavily, because the catcher position, in my opinion, in a lot of cases, especially hitting-wise, in the MLB right now, is somewhat thin. And if you look around, I mean, there's not a whole, I mean, Mitch Garver, sure, I'll give him that in Minnesota. You know, Tucker Barnhart, I mean, he won a Gold Glove, and he's a very good catcher behind the plate for the Cincinnati Reds. But Garver's a decent hitter, and I think that he's got a lot of potential. I mean, he had a good hitting year last year, but Barnhart's an okay hitter. I mean, he's not great. Then, you know, you've obviously got Yasmani Grandal. I mean, he was hit or miss. I mean, he had a really great year in Milwaukee, and then he goes to Chicago, and he's terrible. You obviously have Wilson Contreras and Yadier Molina. I mean, he's starting to get older. And then you've got some new guys coming up like Will Smith for the Dodgers. But honestly, I think d'Arnaud could land on a lot of different teams. I was actually, mentioning this a couple days ago to some friends of mine. I said, don't be shocked if d'Arnaud winds up on a team like in the NL Central that's looking for a catcher. I mean, a team that could maybe make some noise and that could really kind of, I think boost in and, bolster this, some teams not only hitting, but just, I think, overall depth in the lineup. I mean, there's some teams that are really, I think, lacking at one team. And again, maybe it's because I'm biased and I'm a Brewers fan, but if you think about it, it does make a lot of sense with the Milwaukee Brewers. If you had a guy like d'Arnaud, you could probably get him for not a whole lot. You don't have to pay him a huge contract. He is 31, 32 years old, so who knows how long he's going to last still. And especially as a catcher, I mean, eventually your legs start going and your knees start giving out. So it'll be interesting to see maybe a team that like the Brewers. I mean, Omar Narvaez was not very good this year. I mean, he hit below 200 the entire season, and an average defensive catcher, not, and maybe even somebody like the New York Yankees. I think they really like the guy that I can't remember his name right now, but he backed up Gary Sanchez this past year. But Gary Sanchez, I think that he's kind of overrated sometimes. I mean, sure, he's had a lot of pop in his bat the last 2 or 3 years. And if you're a catcher and you're hitting 30-plus home runs in back-to-back seasons, you're going to catch a lot of people's eyes no matter what. And I think he's starting to kind of plateau and decline a little bit. So maybe he lands on a team like the Yankees. I have no idea where d'Arnaud will go, but he's going to be an intriguing free agent to see where he winds up eventually. So the final one that I want to mention of the Silver Sluggers that jumped up to me the most, Teoscar Hernandez. A home run constant. That's how I kind of describe Hernandez, because he seemed to really never slow down, and he really kept his stride in full swing for much of the year. He had a career year, as a matter of fact, batting higher than 265 for the first time in his career. He batted 289, and the 27-year-old outfielder also belted 16 homers and 34 RBIs. So he was doing some serious damage in the lineup. Again, that's why I call him a home run constant, because it seems like, he was constantly just getting a home run, especially in the first part of the season. I mean, he was on a tear early on. he also had his OPS skyrocket, going from 778 last year to going up to 919 this year, and his OPS plus jumped up 40 points, over 40 points, I should say, from 105 last year to 146. So some serious improvements from the plate for Hernandez. I think the Blue Jays definitely have something very special going on here, and if guys like Hernandez start developing more, they have a top-notch farm system already. They've got that covered. They can bring guys up through that. They have some up-and-coming players besides Hernandez, like Vladdy Jr., Kevin Biggio. You've got Bo Bichette. Bo Bichette is going to, I think, become one of the best shortstops in baseball in a matter of a couple years. I mean, he's got a great bat. So that is definitely telling me that there is something special going on in Toronto and that they could definitely become kind of a contending team. I mean, I'm not saying that they'll be a World Series contending team, but I think that you'll start seeing them in the playoff picture much more frequently in the next couple years as this team continues to develop, because I think what they're kind of doing is they're just waiting it out. They're waiting for these younger stars to start improving and developing and becoming the players that everybody knows that they're capable of being. I mean, if you're Vlad Jr., and if you're just a scout or an observer and you're watching him in the home run derby in 2019, there is no way that you could say that he's got no future. I don't think he'll be very good. There's no way. And again, he's very young, so he's still figuring it out. Once he figures it out, I mean, it's going to be hard to unfigure it out, right? I mean, he's going to be really, really good, and that's going to be all she wrote, I think, for a lot of teams and opposing pitchers. And then all of a sudden you throw in a guy like Teoscar Hernandez. I can't remember if he's a free agent or not. He may or may not. But if you keep a guy like Hernandez around, and you really kind of start with him, and then you go from there. You got Guerrero, and then you've got Biggio, you've got Bo Bichette, you've got, again, I mean, I think that they could definitely, boosting up a little bit on the third base side. Travis Shaw has been, he's been okay ever since, 2017 when he had a really good year. But ever since then, I mean, he has not been anything special. So maybe they go after somebody in free agency. And if they're able to scoop somebody up in free agency at the third base position for not a whole lot of money, then they could potentially go after somebody like Trevor Bauer, who a lot of people think they will go after because of, again, his willingness to go anywhere and everywhere. But having a guy like Teoscar Hernandez, especially having this year that he had, I mean, he was without doubt one of my favorite players in the league this year to watch and really just see his development from game after game after game. He continued to get better, and I mean, he jumped up over 20 points in his batting average from his normal career high, his original career high. He had a career high in pretty much almost every single, and easily he would have had a career high in every single statistic if it was a full season. But even without a full season, he still had a career season. He still had a career year without a doubt. So there's a lot of fun things that are brewing over in Toronto that I'm excited to see what kind of happens in the next couple of years. So that will close things out here for us in our second segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. But coming up after the break, I'm going to get into discussing my year in review and what I think were big takeaways and interesting aspects of this season. Folks, it's been a lot of fun so far, but we've got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Reinauer again, and in the last segment, I went right into talking about the Gold Glove and Silver Slugger Award winners that really stuck out to me. I want to now get into discussing the year in review, really, and mentioning some things that stuck out to me from this season, sharing my opinions of the season and what I think will stick around after this year, and what changes from baseball will probably not be around after this season. So first and foremost, just fanless games. I think we can all agree that was probably the weirdest thing that we had to deal with all year. Now, the second thing was, unlike other leagues, I feel there was no other issues that were kind of, ushered into the season with, right? In terms of, you had the labor negotiations that were going on while COVID was going on. So didn't really have that problem with the NFL as much, didn't really have that problem with the NBA or the NHL or really any of these other major professional leagues. The MLB, that was a long, and I think people sometimes forget about that. That was a long-standing back and forth between the Player Association and the MLB. And, for a couple weeks, a lot of people were saying, are we going to even have baseball? And I remember it very, very well because we were starting to inch closer and closer into June, and there was still no agreement on either side. I know that, the owners and the teams, they were coming back with, hey, we'll play 60 games or we'll play 72 games, 82 games. The players wanted to play over 100 games, and their counter offers were just astronomical. And I was always saying to people, I said, there is no way that the MLB is going to cave in on some of these counter offers by the player associations just so they can get a season going. At the end of the day, they're losing money too, and they don't want to have to shelve out more money, and then they wind up, losing a ton of money. And so, obviously you have to take into consideration guys wanted to be safe, and that's why a lot of guys did opt out because they were unsure of kind of everything that was going on in the season. So at the same time, you do understand why guys want to be paid in full because they don't want to be shortchanged because at the end of the day, they are going out there playing and risking their health just so they can, make money for themselves, but also make money for these teams and these owners and the league and so on and so forth. So that right there was just an interesting start to baseball. You had labor negotiations, then you had COVID. And then as we get into the season, all of a sudden, you've got, the craziest thing for me was having all of these outbreaks, and most importantly, the outbreaks on the Marlins and the Cardinals. And I had a feeling at one point or another this was going to happen, just because I knew that guys were not going to take this serious and, they weren't going to be, it's really kind of, it's kind of being caught between a rock and a hard place. You understand that some of these guys are probably 22, 23, 24 years old. They're professional athletes, and they feel invincible, in the middle of this, which, again, I can see why they think like that. But at the same time, you have to be courteous. You have to be, you have to factor in other people on your team that might be sick. Perfect example, Carlos Carrasco had leukemia in 2019. I remember talking about this a couple episodes, a while ago, I should say, probably a couple months ago, actually. And when Shane Bieber when Mike Clevenger and Zach Plesac went out in Chicago, that was a perfect example of why it is so serious that these guys take these rules to, and follow them to a T, and they don't go out of line, or they don't try and, change their opinion or change their mind or this, that, and the other, because if they do, that's going to come back to bite them. That's going to come back to really haunt them. And as a result, it did. You had, Clevenger eventually got dealt. He eventually got traded. And Plesac, we really didn't see much or hear much of him after that. And they were both demoted after that, actually. And it could have potentially thrown off their service time. That could affect their free agency. So I think it was a big eye-opening experience for a lot of these players that went into the season saying, oh, this is nothing. It's not a big deal. Now it could have affected potentially their career moving forward. These little mistakes that they decide to do and these little, decisions that they're making have a lasting impact on everybody else around them, but then also themselves. And that, I think, it was kind of a big eye-opening experience for a lot of guys. But just having all of those outbreaks that we had, it was kind of, at one point or another, I felt that at any moment the season could have been canceled. And it did feel like that in some situations in the middle of, July or in the middle of August, towards the end of August, as we got into September. I was always questioning, what if this starts happening in the playoffs? What if playoff games have to start getting canceled? Because at that point, we didn't really know what the playoffs were going to look like. And I think they were still ironing out those details. And I think, and again, another big question that kind of, I felt, circled this entire season, it was the idea of a bubble. And they did use that in the playoffs, and it definitely worked. But a lot of people, and again, that was another thing going into the season that at least I had a lot of people asking me, do you think that a bubble would work? Do you think a bubble could have worked? Do you think a bubble could have been an idea, or at least, a thought? And clearly it was a thought. Clearly it was an idea that they had, but it was not going to be one I felt that was going to work because of just the sheer numbers that you have in players, personnel, and the list goes on. There's no way that you could find a legitimate bubble to house multiple games going on simultaneously. Again, that's a lot of land because that's a huge baseball. It's a lot of baseball. And you've got all of those players you'd have to house. There is just no way it could have worked. And so I felt like no matter what, baseball was just going to have to march forward. If they wanted to have a season, they were just going to have to be aware of the risk. They were going to have to follow those rules. And some teams did and some teams didn't. And as a result, and again, I don't know if the Cardinals or the Marlins really, I don't know if it was a proven fact that they were going out. I know that the Marlins might have been a proven fact. I don't know about the Cardinals. But again, it was just those irresponsible decisions that teams were making early on in the season that were just big-time head-scratchers for me, because I'm saying, why would you want to jeopardize not only your season, your team, your teammates' health, your health, but then also, simply enough, making money? I mean, if there's no game, you're not playing, and if you're not playing, you're not getting paid, and if you're not getting paid, you don't have the money. So, and listen, everybody is struggling with money this year. I mean, it's kind of an overall theme right now, and as a result, I think that players, as the season went on, I believe, and at least, it was probably, again, another wake-up call for a couple of these teams. Hey, some of these teams are starting to, get it. They're starting to contract it. It's starting to spread. Now other teams are starting to get affected. I mean, that was another thing. Like, this was a big domino effect a lot of the times when you would have one team get it, and then all of a sudden those last three teams that they played against, you'd have to backtrace to say, okay, were they with them, were they with them, and were they with them, and then go from there and say, well, who did those teams possibly come in contact with? So it was just a humongous nightmare. But I will say, in the midst of this big nightmare that we just went through, and we're still kind of going through, there were some great performances from guys. There were some incredible, there's some nice surprises in baseball. And I think it was kind of a blessing in disguise. We got to see teams like the Marlins and the Padres, and we got to see other teams, like the Reds. We got to see these ball clubs that aren't usually in the playoffs. It's not your usual, the San Francisco Giants, or, obviously the Dodgers were in it, obviously, the Yankees were in it, but you didn't see the Red Sox. You didn't see, teams that were very familiar with moving on and further and further and further into the playoffs. And that was exciting. That was fun to see, because then you get kind of to watch other teams that you don't normally get to see, like the Reds or the Padres, or the Marlins. I mean, the Marlins were a solid baseball team. I mean, they weren't great, but they were solid this year. And I feel like they were hardly ever on TV, but they still made the playoffs. And I think that's the unique thing of it. And sure, there was teams that got in, like, again, the Brewers. I mean, they're a perfect example. They got in with a losing record, and I think that, again, goes to show you just the sheer oddness of this season that we just had to go through, was you had teams going into the playoffs with losing records. But again, at the same time, like I mentioned, you had teams that were going into the playoffs that had never been in the playoffs in quite some time. I mean, the Marlins had not been in the playoffs in almost 20 years. The Padres hadn't been in the playoffs for almost 15 years, about 14 years. The Reds hadn't been in it since 2013. So you had three teams that had not made a playoff appearance in at least 7 years or longer. That, again, that is a very unique situation that you do not see very often. And I think that also was, it just made, I feel like, baseball playoffs a lot more interesting, in my opinion. And not to mention, I mean, you saw guys like, Marcell Ozuna step up big time this year. You've got guys like Donovan Solano who stepped up big time. You've got guys like Jose Abreu who had an incredible season. Or you've got guys like Shane Bieber, or Yu Darvish. And again, sure, it's on a smaller sample size. It was 60 games, so you can only, gauge as much as you can on that. But at the same time, it's better than nothing. And it showed that they were, it honestly, in some cases, this shorter season might have actually been a benefit to a lot of these guys that were maybe fringe players, or they were maybe on the verge of being cut after the season, or they weren't sure what their position or their role was on the team. After this year, small sample size, 60 games, some guys really benefited from that. Some guys really capitalized on that, and I think that they not only gave themselves confidence, but they were able to set Travis, again, last segment I was just talking about, Travis Darnell was a perfect example of somebody that, coming into this year, he had never hit above 300 in an entire season. And then all of a sudden, in 60 games, he's hitting over 300. Now you've got the attention of a lot of other teams, and a lot of other, scouts and GMs and owners are, hey, let's pay attention to this guy now. Yeah, it was only 60 games, but it's better than nothing. And he was consistent the entire way through. So he's proven that he can be consistent through an entire season. How long might that season be? Who knows? But I think that, it shows that, guys were able to definitely carry that carry that, and then you also had other guys that weren't able to carry that throughout the season, that really strong play, and they stayed consistent throughout the entire year. You had guys like, at one point or another, we're talking about whether or not Charlie Blackmon is going to be the next guy to hit 400 for the season, and that was a huge topic for about 3-4 weeks, I remember, because he exploded on to the scene in the first 20 or 25 games of the year. He was batting well over 400, and I remember everybody saying, well, he's a third of the way through the season and he's hitting over 400. He could hit close to 500. And I think that's another thing that we saw that was very unique. You had, fanless games. You had, virus outbreaks on teams. You had teams make the playoffs that don't usually make it. You had a guy that almost hit 400 for a year. You had, guys that were well under 2 for an ERA, like Shane Bieber and Trevor Bauer. And you also had, the other thing was, and I knew this would be kind of skewed a little bit with the statistics, right? And again, and I think that kind of goes back to Travis Darnell's point is, you can only take that with a grain of salt, I think, in some regards, but it still does show that in an entire season, he can stay consistent at whatever level that might be. And if that's the case, he's going to have a lot of eyes starting to pay attention to him. But at the same time, it's a small sample size, and the stats can be skewed. The stats can be off because a lot of guys could have maybe started to decline as the season went on after the first 60 games. We see that all the time, and we have no idea if that would have happened this year because we only played 60 games. But the stats, you saw guys that were usually hitting, 40, 50 home runs last year. They're hitting 17, 18, so it kind of redefined, at least just for this year, what was a high home run number, what was a high RBI number. You saw guys that were in the 40s, 50s, and 60s for RBIs, and then the upper teens, lower 20s for home runs. That's a lot of that was a really good. That was a really good season this year. Being that good for 60 games, that was a really, really, really good season. So I think that's another thing that was kind of unique about it was just the oddness of these stats and just how how different they were to read and kind of, judge and really get an idea of, okay, what is that a good number? Is that a high number for the amount of games that they're playing? But I think on top of all of that, I think that, we got to see things in this baseball. It was a very unique season. And again, although there were some low points, there were some really great points. There were some really high points. And I think seeing the Rays in the World Series was a refresher. I think it was gratifying for not only them, but also for, really baseball and just fans in general, that they know that, hey, you know what, it doesn't have to be the Yankees or the Astros or the Red Sox or the Dodgers or, these big-time main, large market teams that everybody roots for. Instead, it could be the guy that has the lowest payroll in baseball, like the Tampa Bay Rays, and they can go all the way. And it kind of, I think, opened the door for a lot of other low/mid-market teams that would have otherwise said there's no way we'd make the World Series in the next 5-10 years. But the Rays have slowly been chipping away at it, and since Kevin Cash has come over, I think in 2014, 6 years, and all of a sudden you've got a World Series appearance. So I think that is something else to really kind of make note of, is that although there were some low points, there were also some great points because we got to see some guys play that, and we also got to see some teams play and at really high levels that we might have not been able to see at all. And then we also saw teams that were surprising, like the Orioles and the Tigers. Those were two of the more surprising teams. And then we also saw teams that, like the Red Sox, they were terrible this year, and they're usually not that bad. And we also saw the World Series, the reigning World Series champions from 2019, the Washington Nationals, have the worst, if not one of the worst records in baseball. So you saw some very interesting new facets of baseball this year. And I know that probably a lot of Washington fans would say, well, if we had played a whole season, we might have been the ones in the World Series instead of the Dodgers. A lot of people could say that. There's a lot of teams that could say that. And, you can't really hold that real heavy because that just wasn't the situation this year. And whatever was the situation, it was the situation. But I think at the end of the day, what I'm really curious about is, we've had this incredible year. There was some lows and highs, some ups and downs, peaks and valleys. What's it going to look like moving forward? What's next year going to look like? I've actually, tried to do a little bit of research, just trying to figure out, what games might look like, what, will stadiums allow for fans and things along those lines. A lot of teams and a lot of people I don't think know really what's going to happen next year. But I actually had a friend of mine who went to the World Series. He got tickets. He got to go. And I asked him, I said, hey, man, what was it like being at the World Series? What was it like being at a professional sporting event in the middle of a pandemic? And he said, honestly, it just felt like there wasn't many people at the game. There was a lot of people that didn't have their mask on. He said the lines moved pretty quickly, though. People were mostly staying in their seats. It wasn't, he said it was definitely a unique experience, but he said at the end of the day, it felt as normal as it can right now. And I think that a lot of other teams, they might start doing that. Now, the problem is, though, once you factor in, fans are coming to the games, who knows if something could, potentially, get in the air and then gets to a player, and then a player starts contracting it, and then kind of snowballs from there. And then you also have other fans at the games and whatnot. So you're going to have to do a lot of, I think, checking with fans and what it's going to look like in terms of, are they going to have temperature checks? Are they going to have to sign a waiver saying they haven't been around? Are they going to have to quarantine for so many days, this, that, and the other? There's going to be a lot of things moving forward. I mean, baseball's going to look a little weird for probably about a year or so. And it's kind of unfortunate to say that because, I've talked with friends and, I've said it many times, I've really missed going to a ball game this year, but in the situation that we were in, there was only so much we could do. But all in all, I think that even though baseball might be different next year and, for however long it might be, at least we have it. At least it isn't going anywhere. At least we'll still see some action out on the diamond. At least there will still be, exciting moments in baseball. Yeah, we might not be able to watch them in person, but one day we will be, and I think at the end of the day, after just wrapping up this year, you got to take everything kind of, half glass full instead of half glass empty. We were able to have a season. We were able to see some baseball. We were able to see some historic performances. We were able to see some new teams come up through the rankings and really show their dominance. We got to see things that we might not have been able to see if it had been a normal regular season because it was, again, jam-packed into 60 games. We got to see unique things and different things that we would not have probably have seen. I mean, the Marlins probably would not have made the playoffs if it was a regular season. The Brewers might not have made the playoffs if it was a regular season, and the Astros might not have made the playoffs if it was a regular full 162-game season. But what it did eventually and what it did regardless is now we got to see teams like the Marlins. They got to showcase their abilities. We saw the teams like the Reds showcase their abilities. Guys like now Trevor Bauer, Travis Darnell, able to set themselves apart from other free agents in the market with their performances this past year. All in all, you have to look at it, I think, half glass full, and I think there was a lot of positives to take from this year, and there was a lot of exciting things that I really liked, and, I was just running through a couple things, but at the end of the day, it was an incredible year. I'm excited for next season, and whenever we can all go back to baseball games, we all know who's going to be getting a ticket immediately, and that's going to be me. Without question, I'm going to buy a ticket. The day that I hear that tickets are able to be sold and you can go to a baseball game, I'm going to be there, without question. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. Thanks again for sticking around as always. Stay right there, though, because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I'll get into the recent story involving a former Rays baseball prospect and the murder conviction that he has just recently received. Folks, do not go anywhere because we have one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the last segment I got into my year-in review and talked about the things that really stuck out to me, what my thoughts are about the season as a whole, and a lot more. But I want to finish out with some startling news that came out recently in the baseball world involving a former highly touted prospect now being convicted for murder. So Brandon Martin was a former first-round draft pick for the Tampa Bay Rays back in 2011, where he actually started playing in the minors at the very young age of 17. He only played a couple years in the minors before ultimately getting released by the Rays. So a very young start to your professional career without question. I mean, 17 years old, being thrusted into the minor leagues, that's got to be a very, very large difference from going and playing high school baseball to minor league baseball. Now, the former shortstop standout only spent really about 3 or so years, like I mentioned, the minors, and again, things started to really pile up on him, and things kind of started to spiral out of control, honestly. In 2015, Martin was experiencing some psychological issues and was ultimately admitted into the hospital by his father for evaluations. Well, Martin clearly was not a fan of what was happening to him, and he did not like that in the slightest. So a few days later, he actually went back to his father's house after he was, excused out of the facility. And again, his father, who, mind you, was disabled and he actually was having a security camera installed into his house because Martin had made threats toward his father many times before. So he was just having the security installed in order to keep himself safe from Martin, who would, if he were to become violent, and clearly he did become violent. Martin came back to his father's house while the security install guy was being installed, or was there installing the technology and everything, and he absolutely went ballistic. He took a bat and beat his father, his uncle, and the security technician to a pulp, killing all 3 men and wound up stealing a car also to go and hide out after the killings. And then he wound up being found by an off-duty police officer. A chase ensued. He actually went into the home of a completely random woman, tried to just hide there, and then he tried to get out of a second-story building before being met by a police officer with a canine, and they again went with a struggle, and eventually he was subdued and was taken down. And he was actually recently brought up on the charges and found guilty of the killings, as well as numerous other charges that he would face. So a slew of issues that Martin ran into, and quite frankly, it's kind of unfortunate to see something like that happen. Somebody that had such a promising career and obviously did not turn out the right way and, did not pan out. I think that probably himself and his family and his friends and teammates and coaches and all the sort probably figured in the long run that would happen to him. And, one thing happens and then something else happens and, things start to pile up, and as a result, if you're not getting the help or the treatment that you might need, then that's when things like that definitely happen, and it's a very unfortunate situation for Martin's family with family members passing away and being murdered, with him going to jail for those murders. It's just not a great situation. But honestly, this kind of reminds me of some other baseball players in the past that have had some major issues in terms of crimes that they've committed and different legal issues that they've had to deal with off the field. And, recently, this kind of reminds me of the Felipe Vasquez situation. I believe it was last year or the year before, where, a star-studded closer for the Pittsburgh Pirates, he at that point had been one of arguably the best closers in baseball. The guy was lights out. And he was, again, caught with having a relationship with a 15-year-old girl, I believe it was. She was an underage minor, and, he claimed that he did not know how old she was, and this, that, and the other. And, one thing led to another, and then all of a sudden he's getting charged with, sexual assault of a minor, and, he might be going to jail for a very, very long time. I don't know what the, situation is with that right now, but he's, again, another case of somebody that is going to definitely face hard time for what he did. And, when you're in the limelight like that and when you're in the spotlight, it's kind of like, why would you even think of doing something like that? And if you are thinking of doing something like that, why don't you go seek the help that you are able to go see? You're a professional athlete. You can definitely pay for that. You can definitely afford that. And, you don't want to have something like that come out in the public eye. Obviously, not only for you, but for your teammates, for your entire organization. That's a public relations nightmare. Talk about dealing with crisis communication. That would be a major crisis that any team would have to deal with, a former player. And at the time, he was actually a current player. So a current player being, brought up on charges so severe like murder or rape or, whatever it might be, that is very heinous. That's not good. That's not a good public image that you want to relay. But there's been other guys that have also, found some major legality issues in baseball. One of them being Mel Hall, very similar to Felipe Vasquez. He was actually, again, another child predator. And what was really unfortunate about this situation was that he wound up, after his playing days, he became a youth sports coach, which again allowed him to have access to being around young, impressionable, children. And unfortunately, he was somebody that was targeting these children, and he was a predator, and he was a former baseball player. I mean, just think about it. You're a kid growing up, and your favorite baseball player you're rooting for is actually also a child predator. That's got to really mess with some people, and especially with, how his career kind of wound up. I mean, he wound up after being in the MLB for, quite some time. Mel Hall was eventually arrested for rape in 2009. He was actually sentenced to 45 years in prison. So clearly somebody that had a lot of issues, a lot of issues, that definitely, a main issue in, being a child predator that resulted in his, going to jail and eventually becoming, somebody that was deemed as not a player that you would want to be a fan of, and not a player that you would want to idolize and look up to. And again, that's the other thing. You've got young kids that are looking up to you, that are aspiring to be like you. You're a role model for these kids. And, when something like this happens, it's really unfortunate. And another guy, Lenny Dykstra, he was a very good baseball player, a 3-time All-Star. He played for many, many years in the MLB. He had millions of different issues. I mean, he had a scam business that actually defrauded a bunch of people out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And again, he really got into a lot of credit card fraud, money laundering, grand theft, larceny, and he really tried anything and everything to try and dig himself out of the scamming business that he got himself into. And it was, and again, another very unfortunate, kind of outcome for him. He was eventually arrested for sexual harassment, accused of sexual assault, and convicted for sexual misconduct after, trying to solicit, illegal, unwarranted sexual acts through Craigslist on several different occasions. So again, another person right there that is having some major issues off the field. And it's kind of a constant theme that we're seeing. There's another guy, Julio Machado. He was a very, very talented pitcher in the both for the Mets and then also with the Brewers. Very young when this happened. I mean, he was in the, potentially getting into the peak of his career, really the prime part of it. And unfortunately, he was at he had a car accident happen, and he got out, and an argument ensued with himself and the other driver, who was a female. Her name was Adicta Vasquez. So again, she was, an innocent bystander that just happened to have a little fender bender or, a little run into with Machado, and all of a sudden he just pulled out a gun and shot her. And he claimed that he was trying to let off warning shots, but unfortunately that warning shot did not go in the correct direction, and it wound up killing her instantly. He shot her in the head. And, it's very unfortunate how this kind of transpired and really, spiraled out of control for him. And he wound up, being sentenced to 12 years in prison for manslaughter. He did get the charges from murder to, reduced to manslaughter. So, again, besides the point, he took an innocent life, just like how Brandon Martin took 3 innocent people's lives. And Felipe Vasquez and Mel Hall have really distorted a lot of young children's, minds and lives with their inappropriate and unwarranted sexual advancements and sexual desires that are clearly just wrong in so many ways, and just really disgusting, if you will. I mean, that would probably be the best word to describe it, is just disgusting. But it's really unfortunate. And again, I keep coming back to this point because you've got so much going for you as a professional athlete. You've got so many people looking up to you, even if they're not kids. They're people that are in their mid to late teens, and they're trying to mold themselves into the player that you might be as a professional athlete. You've got all the eyes on you all the time. And when you've got things like that happening in your career off the field, whether it's murder charges or rape charges or fraud charges or, embezzlement charges, whatever it might be, it's not going to bode well for not only you, but also for that fan base that you built up and that you had at one point. And it's kind of an unfortunate turn of events that happens in some of these player careers. Now, on the other side of it, there's been other baseball, legality issues and things that have gone around that have not been as serious and not as severe as, rape and murder, but have been, that have occurred in the game, in field, while the game was going on. And one that really sticks out to me is, the pine tar issue, using too much pine tar. I mean, a famous instance is George Brett back in the 80s. He hits a walk-off home run, and they actually call him out because he apparently used too much pine tar. They actually go back and review it again, and they actually award the win to the Royals because they were, again, wrong on the initial challenge that they tried to, argue. And, again, it's two opposite ends of the spectrum, but neither one of them you want to be on. You don't want to be the guy that's known for using a lot of pine tar, or a guy that's, corking his bat. I mean, that's always been a big thing in baseball. Steroids, obviously, sign stealing, of course, recently. And, then you have on the other side, you've got guys that are players, and who knows what they're doing off the field, clearly not what they're supposed to be doing. And then you've got, in situations, you've got guys like Mel Hall, who should not be, a youth coach in any sort of regard at all, being around children that he clearly has some weird fascination with. And it, again, opens doors to things that people do not want to have open to. And it's a very unfortunate thing that occurs. But at the same, and I think the issue is that some of these professional athletes, and again, I know I'm probably, and I don't mean to speak for them because I have no idea what their lives are like and I have no idea what goes through their mind, but I'm sure there is some sort of, hey, I know that I'm in this position. I know that people are going to like me. I know that people are going to root for me and cheer for me. I can take advantage of this, and I can manipulate people because of who I am, my stature, my, whether it's, you're a famous athlete or you're a guy that plays on the team or whatever it might be, your status and your stature as that player, it's going to, resonate well initially with people when they see you on the outside and they say, hey, you're a professional baseball player. You play on the Giants or you play on the Yankees. I'm a big fan of yours, so on and so forth. And so they can kind of take advantage of people in that regard. They can take advantage of those innocent, fans and families. I mean, the one thing that I was reading in an article about all of this was, Mel Hall would basically become very friendly with these parents of these players, of these, of the, kids that he was coaching, and then he would just take advantage of them. I mean, that is probably the worst thing that you could one of the worst things that you could possibly do to anybody. I mean, that's a full violation and full manipulation of somebody in so many regards. And, going back to originally, bringing up Martin, I mean, that's just a really unfortunate, I think, thing that occurred. I think it's a situation of somebody that did not receive the proper help that he probably needed and probably did not see somebody when he should have seen somebody and, got the proper treatment, proper, whatever it might have been in order to make sure that something like this did not occur. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. He did not get that. And as a result, now we have this situation where he's going to jail and he has, he's got, the life of 3 people on his hands because of what he did. And it's very unfortunate. And, I mean, you see it in all sports. There's so many different cases that have occurred. I mean, there's, famous murder cases for former athletes like O.J. Simpson. I mean, that's probably one of the most famous cases ever. I mean, they've got an entire ESPN 30 for 30 series on that, so that just tells you how impactful that was in the 90s and in our society in general. But I think it's also it shows how some professional athletes, I do believe they think they can get away with things because they are professional athletes. And I know that in Brandon Martin's case, probably a little bit different because he was, only a 3-year minor league guy. Sure, he was a first-round draft pick by the Rays, but, he never really turned into anybody special. Whereas some of these other guys, I mean, they played for years. Lenny Dykstra, like I said, he was a former All-Star. Somebody that clearly probably had a lot of fans for him. And who knows, out of that, fraudulent scam business that he had, who knows how many fans he scammed, how many people that got into it or that were, became a part of it or wanted his services for whatever reason were fans of his or were fans of the teams that he played for. And then he winds up, backstabbing them and taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from them. It's like, playing professional baseball for so many years just wasn't enough. And it's just really unfortunate that I think it comes down to the idea of I have, this kind of innate, aura about me. I'm a professional athlete. I've got this stigma that follows that, people are going to like me. People are going to, root for me. I do a good job. People are going to be fans of mine. I'm going to have my own fan base. I'm going to have my own following. I can take advantage of that, and I can take advantage of people doing that. And I can really, that's using your platform in a very negative way. That's using what you are as a professional athlete. And again, professional athletes have arguably one of the biggest platforms in all of society. And that's using it in the wrong way. And not to mention, it makes the teams look bad, too. And again, I don't think it's going to make the Rays look bad that they drafted somebody, almost 10 years ago that hasn't had any relation with the organization in almost 5 years. I don't think that's really going to affect anything in the long run for them. But it's definitely, look at it, going back to Felipe Vasquez. Look at a team like the Pirates, who are already a struggling franchise, have clearly enough issues on their hands with a disgruntled fan base. A lot of people are not happy with the owner, with the team, how it's ran. It's not a good ball team at all. I mean, living in Pittsburgh, I can tell you that right now they are not good, and there's a lot of angry fans. And then you've got your main closer. At that time, he was their best pitcher, now being charged for sexual assault and potentially rape of a minor. And that right there, it just is the worst thing, the last thing that you would need for an already struggling ball club that is already having its own issues, whether it's with the fans or with the media or whatever it might be. That just adds to it. And it's probably the last thing that they need at the time. They don't need something more added to it. So that's another thing that brings into it is that, some of these players, they don't realize that their actions have consequences. And it's not just for them, but for also the teams. Imagine, I have no idea if something were to happen like that today, what Rob Manfred and the MLB would do to the team. Probably nothing, because they can't really, control what happens off, on their, outside of their facility and on their players' own time. But it would be, something like that would really rock the baseball world, especially with where we're at right now with COVID and people aren't, allowed to go to games and everything else. Having a player come down with some sort of case like that or committing some sort of heinous crime, that would be the absolute last thing that baseball would need in general. And I remember seeing this story pop on my phone. I just shook my head and I just said, I just can't believe that, it has to come to that, and that has to be a result. But again, I don't mean to bring up, such a negative topic, because there's been so many incredible baseball players over the years that have done so many impactful things for, their where they're from, for their communities, for, the people in the area that they play in with those teams, whatever it might be, starting youth programs, starting youth teams, starting foundations, nonprofit organizations. There's been so many, and again, the good baseball players clearly outweigh the guys that are not the greatest character players. It's just unfortunate that those poor character baseball players, they're the ones that people are going to, again, that news is going to attract you, and it's going to steer your attention in that direction, because it's so awful and it's so jaw-dropping that you're going to read it. Whereas something about a guy starting a nonprofit organization or whatever, that's just kind of, I'm going to just read it over and then that's it. I'm not going to look into it because, and again, that's the unfortunate thing. But there's been so many incredible baseball players over the years, and it's unfortunate that although there has been and there continues to be unbelievable ambassadors of the game of baseball, there is that 10% that are not part of that group as much. There are definitely a lot of issues and there's a lot of problems, and hopefully if there is a player out there that is having, maybe it's some battle or some, whatever is going on in their life, they can go seek that help and they can go, figure it out, so we don't have to continue to hear stories like this. But again, nonetheless, it is what it is. What happened is what happened, and all you can say is just you hope for the best for all these families that have been affected in negative ways by these actions that have occurred. But again, back to, at the end of the day, not all baseball players are bad. In all honesty, they're incredible. They're great. They do a lot of wonderful things for the community, for their communities, and their impact in, I think, just sports and society speaks volume, and I think that they're just incredible role models for kids and fans all around the world without question. So that'll wrap it up for us here today. Thank you again for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we'd also really appreciate that. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in, and as always, have a fantastic day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.